The classroom was silent except for the faint scratching of pencils on paper. Mrs. Eleanor Carter, a dedicated teacher with decades of experience, scanned the room, her warm brown eyes lingering on a particular student. Seated in the last row was Jacob Evans, a 14-year-old boy whose shoulders slumped under the weight of something far heavier than just schoolwork. Unlike his classmates, whose desks were stacked with colorful textbooks, Jacob had only a worn-out notebook and a broken pencil. Have you ever wondered how a simple act of kindness can change the course of someone's life? Sometimes, it's not grand gestures or big donations that leave the greatest impact. It's the smallest things, given at the right moment, that can transform a person's fate. Jacob had always been a bright student. His mind was sharp, his curiosity boundless. But lately, he had begun to withdraw. Mrs. Carter noticed that he never brought his textbooks to class, never raised his hand to answer questions like he used to, and never stayed after school for extra help. She knew something was wrong, and as a teacher, she couldn't ignore it. One afternoon, as the students filed out of the classroom, Mrs. Carter gently called Jacob's name. He hesitated before approaching her desk, his eyes filled with an uneasiness that suggested he was used to disappointment. "Jacob," she said with a kind smile, "I've noticed you haven't been bringing your books to class. Is everything okay?" Jacob's gaze dropped to the floor. His fingers gripped the strap of his worn-out backpack, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, in a barely audible voice, he muttered, We couldn't afford them this year." Mrs. Carter felt her heart sink. She had suspected it, but hearing it from Jacob himself confirmed her fears. She knew she had to do something, but she also knew that Jacob was too proud to accept charity outright. She had to find a way to help him without making him feel like a charity case. Little did she know, the choice she was about to make would change both of their lives forever. That evening, Mrs. Carter sat at her desk long after the other teachers had gone home. She couldn't shake the sadness in Jacob's voice. She had taught many struggling students over the years, but something about Jacob struck her differently. He wasn't just another kid facing hardship. He was a student with immense potential, a boy who genuinely loved learning, but was being held back by circumstances beyond his control. After some thought, she stood up, walked to the supply closet, and rummaged through the extra textbooks. She found the ones Jacob needed: math, science, English, and history. They weren't brand new, but they were in good condition. However, simply handing them to Jacob wasn't an option. She knew he'd refuse them out of pride. The next day, Mrs. Carter came up with a plan. As Jacob was about to leave after class, she called him over again. "Jacob, I have a little problem," she said, pretending to sigh in frustration. "I have some extra textbooks, and I don't know what to do with them. The school ordered too many, and I don't want them to go to waste. Do you think you could help me by keeping these and using them for class? It would really help me out." Jacob hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. I don't know, Mrs. Carter. Please," she interrupted with a smile, placing a hand on the stack of books. "I'd feel terrible if they just sat here collecting dust. You'd actually be doing me a huge favor." Jacob studied her for a long moment, then nodded, albeit hesitantly. "Okay, if it helps you, I guess I can take them." Mrs. Carter exhaled in relief as he gathered the books into his arms. "Thank you, Jacob. You have no idea how much this means to me." For the first time in weeks, she saw a spark in his eyes. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob slowly regained his confidence. He no longer sat in the back of the class with his head down. He answered questions again, his hand shooting up with enthusiasm. He stayed after school to study, no longer making excuses about missing books. One afternoon, as he packed up his things, he looked at Mrs. Carter and said, "I really appreciate what you did for me. I'll pay you back someday." She chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Just promise me that one day, when you're in a position to help someone, you will." Jacob grinned. "Deal." But neither of them could have predicted what that promise would mean years later. Years passed, and Jacob graduated with top honors. Despite the struggles he faced at home, he never let his circumstances define him. Thanks to scholarships and part-time jobs, he managed to attend college, majoring in education, something he had never imagined possible back when he couldn't even afford textbooks. Through hard work and perseverance, Jacob built a successful career. He eventually became a well-respected professor, teaching at one of the country's top universities. Yet, no matter how far he went, he never forgot the woman who had believed in him when he had nearly given up. Mrs. Carter. One day, as he scrolled through news articles, an unexpected headline caught his attention. Local teacher faces eviction after 30 years of service. His heart pounded as he clicked the link. The article detailed how Mrs. Carter, now retired, had been struggling financially. Due to rising medical expenses and a lack of sufficient pension funds, she was at risk of losing her home. Jacob sat back in his chair, emotions flooding him. This was the woman who had saved him, who had gone out of her way to help him when he had nothing. Now, she was the one in need. He immediately called the reporter who had written the article, asking for more details. "She's been a pillar of the community," the reporter said. "But retirement hasn't been kind to her. She tried tutoring, but her health makes it difficult. It's heartbreaking." Jacob knew what he had to do. The next morning, he boarded a flight to his hometown. As he arrived at Mrs. Carter's modest home, he saw moving boxes stacked on the porch. His chest tightened. She really was being forced to leave. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. Mrs. Carter stood there, looking frail, yet still carrying the warmth he remembered. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Carter," he said, smiling. "It's been a long time." She invited him inside, offering him tea, just as she used to after school years ago. As they sat in her small living room, he finally said, "I saw the article about you. Why didn't you reach out?" She sighed, shaking her head. "Oh, Jacob, I never wanted to be a burden. I always believed in helping others, not asking for help myself." Jacob smiled knowingly. "That sounds like something you'd say." He reached into his bag and pulled out an envelope. "I made a promise to you once." Mrs. Carter frowned. "A promise?" He handed her the envelope. "When I was a kid, you told me that if I ever got the chance to help someone, I should. You changed my life, Mrs. Carter. Now, it's my turn to return the favor." With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and gasped. Inside was a deed, her home, fully paid off. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. "Jacob, I can't accept this." "You have to," he interrupted gently. "Because you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You gave me a future, and now, I want to make sure you have a secure one too." Mrs. Carter covered her mouth, overwhelmed with emotion. Finally, she whispered, "I'm so proud of you." Jacob reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Everything I am today is because of you." News of Jacob's gesture spread throughout the town. The small community that Mrs. Carter had dedicated her life to was deeply moved by the story of her former student coming back to save her in her time of need. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "From struggling student to respected professor, how one man saved his teacher's home." Soon, former students of Mrs. Carter, who had gone on to lead successful lives in various professions, started reaching out. Many of them credited her for their achievements, recalling how she had pushed them to succeed when they had lost faith in themselves. Some even set up a community fund to ensure she would never have to struggle again. One evening, Jacob sat on the porch of Mrs. Carter's home, sipping tea as they watched the sunset. The house was no longer filled with the dread of eviction. Instead, it was alive with the warmth of security and gratitude. "You know," Mrs. Carter said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never became a teacher expecting anything in return. I just wanted to see my students succeed." Jacob smiled. "And you did. More than you'll ever know." She looked at him thoughtfully. "So what's next for you, Jacob? You've already done so much." He exhaled, looking at the horizon. "I've been thinking about coming back here. Maybe starting a scholarship in your name for kids who need the kind of help I once did." Her eyes shimmered with pride. That would mean the world to so many. Over the next few months, Jacob made that dream a reality. He worked with local schools and organizations to launch the Carter Education Fund, ensuring that underprivileged students had access to resources, tutoring, and scholarships to pursue higher education. The program grew rapidly, drawing the attention of philanthropists and education advocates nationwide. During the inaugural scholarship ceremony, Mrs. Carter was invited as the guest of honor. When she stepped on stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Tears filled her eyes as she looked out at the young faces full of hope, the same kind of hope she had once tried to instill in Jacob. "This," she said, her voice wavering with emotion, "is why I became a teacher. Because every child, no matter their circumstances, deserves a chance to succeed." The audience stood in a standing ovation, and Jacob, watching from the side of the stage, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. As he escorted Mrs. Carter off the stage, she whispered, "You've truly changed lives, Jacob." He shook his head. "No, Mrs. Carter. You did. I just followed your example." In the end, Jacob realized that success wasn't just about personal achievements. It was about lifting others the way he had once been lifted. And thanks to Mrs. Carter, he would spend the rest of his life doing just that.